The year 1187 since the Nativity of Christ. The fourth day of the month of July. The sun, like the molten eye of an enraged deity, mercilessly scorched the parched earth of Galilee. The air shimmered with heat, thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of blood, sweat, and death. Here at the twin hills of Hattin, history had been made just a few hours before. The greatest army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the flower of Frankish knighthood, the pride of the Christian East, had ceased to exist. It had been wiped from the face of the earth, consumed by the sands, hewn by blades and broken by an unquenchable thirst. In a luxurious tent pitched amidst this apocalyptic landscape, the victor reigned. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria, unifier of the Islamic world, known to the Western world as Saladin. His face, usually restrained and noble, was now like a thundercloud. Beside him on carpets sat the prisoners, the most noble of the survivors. Among them was Guy of Lusignan, king consort of Jerusalem, whose crown now seemed no more than a gilded bauble. His lips were cracked, and the horror of the catastrophe he had just endured was frozen in his eyes. Saladin, following the laws of hospitality, offered the king a cup of ice-cold water. Guy drank and, obeying knightly etiquette, passed the cup to his comrade sitting next to him. And at that moment, mercy fled the Sultan's tent. Saladin's face turned to stone. He sharply addressed the interpreter, telling him to inform the king that it was he, Guy, who had given him the drink, not the Sultan. In these words lay a death sentence, for he to whom the Sultan offered food or drink according to the law received a guarantee of his life. But the man who accepted the cup from the king's hand had no such guarantee. This man was Raynald of Châtillon, the robber prince, the scourge of the desert, a man whose audacity and cruelty had become a legend on both sides of the religious divide. He sat upright, showing no fear. His reddish-gray hair was matted and covered with dust, his armor dented and scored, but his blue eyes burned with the same icy, indomitable fire. He looked at Saladin not as a captive at his master, but as an equal at an equal, as a predator at a predator. Saladin saw in him not just an enemy baron. He saw in him the root cause of this war, the living embodiment of perfidy and oath-breaking, the man who had dared to threaten the very heart of Islam, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. This was a personal vendetta, a vow the Sultan had made to himself. No one yet knew that in this tent, under the scorching Galilean sun, not only the fate of one man would be decided, but the outcome of the entire era would be sealed. The fall of Jerusalem, the Third Crusade, the clash between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. All this would be a consequence of the events at the center of which, like a venomous spider in the center of its web, stood he. Raynald of Châtillon, a figure so contradictory, so vivid, and so destructive that historians and chroniclers to this day break their lances trying to unravel his true nature, wondering whether he was a mad adventurer who doomed the Crusader kingdom, or the only one who truly understood the real, merciless nature of the war for the Holy Land. To answer this question, we must embark on a long, multi-hour journey. A journey into the very heart of the 12th century, into a world of fanatical faith and cynical politics. Into the story of a man whose name became synonymous with both desperate courage and unimaginable cruelty. This is the story of Raynald of Châtillon, before the whirlwind of history sweeps up our hero and throws him into the seething cauldron of the Levant. We must pause for a moment to gaze upon the land that bore him. For a man's character, like a tree, is nourished by the saps of his native soil, and his branches reach for the light, repeating the bends and breaks of unseen roots. That land was France in the middle of the 12th century, fragmented, restless, but already feeling within itself the pulse of future greatness. The Kingdom of France in the 1120s when our hero is believed to have been born, was a patchwork quilt of powerful duchies and counties, only nominally subordinate to the king of the Capetian dynasty, whose own domain, the Ile-de-France, was far from the largest or richest. Power was decentralized to the extreme. The dukes of Normandy, who were also kings of England, the counts of Anjou, Toulouse, and Flanders, all were independent rulers waging their own wars, making their own alliances, and at times possessing far more real power than their suzerain in Paris. It was an era of feudal anarchy in its classic form, a world where right was determined by might and loyalty was a commodity with a price. The life of a common man was worth little. The life of a knight hung constantly by a thread, and the only path to advancement besides inheritance was war. Castles like birds of prey gazed from cliffs upon the passing roads, and their lords often saw little difference between levying tolls and outright robbery. Constant internecine strife and private wars between barons were the norm, interrupted only by the Church's periodic attempts to establish the peace of God or the truce of God. It was in this environment, into the noble but not most influential family of Châtillon-sur-Loing, that Reynald was born. The exact date of his birth is lost to the ages, but most historians agree on the period between 1123 and 1125. He was the second son of Hervé II de Donzy, Lord of Châtillon-sur-Loing. This fact, seemingly a minor detail, is actually the key to his entire future destiny. In a world where the principle of majorat or primogeniture prevailed, all the father's land, all the castles and titles passed to the eldest son. Younger sons like Reynald were left with nothing. Only three paths lay before them: a career in the church where one could attain the rank of bishop or abbot, service as a vassal to one's own brother or a more powerful lord in the hope of a modest fief, or the riskiest and most alluring path, the path of the sword and fortune, the path of an adventurer. For an ambitious, proud, and undoubtedly strong young man like Reynald, the choice was obvious. He was not born for prayers and humility. His spirit required a space that feudal Burgundy could not give him. We know almost nothing about his childhood and youth. Chroniclers of the time rarely paid attention to the younger sons of minor barons, but we can confidently reconstruct his upbringing. From an early age, he was taught horsemanship, the use of the sword, spear, and shield. He studied the tactics of small skirmishes, the rules of siege and defense of castles. His world was one of tournaments, hunting, and constant readiness for war. His lullabies were stories of his ancestors' exploits, and his dream was to acquire his own fief, his own name, his own glory. He saw his older brother preparing to receive his inheritance and understood that there was no place for him in this system. This engendered a burning desire to break out, to prove to the whole world, and first and foremost to himself, that he was worth no less and perhaps more than his fortunate brother. In his character, from a young age, such traits as independence, contempt for authority, reliance on his own strength, and ruthlessness towards competitors must have been forged. He was a product of his era, an era where the strongest and most enterprising survived. And then, a call resounded on the historical stage that would change the destinies of thousands of landless, ambitious, and glory-seeking knights just like Reynald. In 1144, the city of Edessa, the capital of the northernmost and most vulnerable of the Crusader states founded after the First Crusade fell. This news shocked the Christian world. Pope Eugene III issued a bull calling for a new Second Crusade, and the main preacher of this holy war became one of the most influential men of the age, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. His sermons were like fire. He traveled through the towns and castles of France and Germany, and his passionate words ignited hearts. He spoke of desecrated shrines, of the suffering Christian brethren in the East, of the sacred duty of every warrior of Christ. To take the cross at that time was not just to go on a military campaign. It was a deeply personal spiritual act. A knight who sewed a cloth cross onto his cloak became a crusader, a pilgrim with a weapon in hand, temporarily stepping outside the jurisdiction of secular laws and coming under the direct protection of the Church. He became a soldier of Christ. For a man like Reynald, this was the perfect symbiosis of the earthly and the heavenly, an opportunity to gain fame and fortune on earth while ensuring the salvation of his soul in heaven. But besides the spiritual motivation, there was also a very worldly one. The crusade promised full remission of sins and indulgence. It gave protection from creditors and legal prosecution during one's absence. And most importantly, it opened up limitless possibilities. In the east, in Outremer, which in French means the land beyond the sea, one could find everything that was so lacking in Europe: land, wealth, titles. There, in battles with the infidels, a landless knight of yesterday could become a powerful baron, a count, or even a prince. It was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. At the head of the crusade stood the two most powerful monarchs of Europe, King Louis VII of France and Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III. In their wake followed thousands of barons, knights, and common soldiers. And among them, in the retinue of the French king, was our young, unknown Raynald of Châtillon. For him, this was a one-way ticket. He was not just going on a pilgrimage or to war. He was going to meet his destiny. He was burning his bridges behind him, leaving behind a world where he was merely his brother's shadow, and rushing into a new, unexplored world where everything was decided only by valor, luck, and the sharpness of one's sword. He did not yet know what awaited him, what trials and what dizzying heights were prepared for him. But one thing he knew for sure: he would not return. The East awaited him, a promised land for some and a grave for others. For Raynald of Châtillon, it would become both. It seemed the very air of Outremer was different. It was thick, spicey, infused with the aromas of spices, hot sand, and ancient mystery. For the knights arriving from rainy and gray Europe, the Holy Land was a world of dazzling contrasts. Parched deserts gave way to fertile valleys, and ascetic knightly castles stood next to luxurious eastern cities where, in bustling bazaars, languages, faiths, and peoples mingled. But behind this exotic facade lay a harsh reality. The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the fallen County of Edessa, were but thin coastal strips of Christian domains, surrounded on all sides by a sea of the Islamic world. Their existence was a constant daily struggle for survival. They were military camps, outposts where every man was a warrior, and every woman knew that her husband or son might not return from the next patrol. The Second Crusade, with which Raynald of Châtillon arrived in the Holy Land in 1147, turned into a complete and humiliating failure. Disagreements between the leaders, tactical blunders, and the brilliant resistance of the Muslim emirs led to an inglorious siege of Damascus, which ended in the Crusaders' retreat. The king's armies returned to Europe, leaving behind only disappointment and bitterness. But for many knights, including Reynald, the failure of the crusade did not mean the end of the road. On the contrary, it was only the beginning. He decided to stay. Outremer, with all its dangers, still beckoned with prospects that did not exist at home. Reynald entered the service of King Baldwin III of Jerusalem. He became a mercenary, selling his sword and combat skills to whoever was willing to pay for them. These were the years that finally hardened him. He participated in countless skirmishes, raids, and sieges. He studied the tactics of light Muslim cavalry, learned to survive in the desert, and understood the complex mosaic of local politics where yesterday's enemies could become today's allies and alliances crumbled like sandcastles. He saw how quickly one could rise here and how even more quickly fall. struck down by a Saracen arrow or an assassin's blade. He was a foreigner, a Frank, but he learned quickly. His reputation grew. He was known as a brave, skilled, and utterly ruthless warrior. He was not looking for friends, he was looking for opportunities. And soon fate would present him with a truly royal chance. And while the king's armies were suffering a fiasco under Damascus in the north, in the great principality of Antioch, its own drama was unfolding. Antioch, once the third largest city of the Roman Empire, was the jewel of the Crusader East. A huge, rich, strategically important fortress city, it controlled the trade routes from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean Sea. But its position was extremely vulnerable. From the east, it was pressed by the powerful Atabeg of Aleppo, Nur ad-Din, son of the same Zangi who had captured Edessa. Nur ad-Din was not just a talented commander. He was the bearer of the idea of jihad, a holy war for the recovery of lost Muslim lands, and Antioch was his main target. The ruler of Antioch was Prince Raynald of Poitiers, a charismatic and valiant warrior. But in 1149, at the Battle of Inab, he fell in battle against Nur ad-Din's army. His severed head placed in a silver casket, Nur ad-Din sent as a gift to the caliph in Baghdad. The principality was left without a ruler, and his widow, Princess Constance, became the most eligible bride in the entire Latin East. Constance of Antioch deserves a separate story. She was not just a grieving widow. She was the ruling princess in her own right, the daughter of the great Bohemond II. Imperious, intelligent, and willful, she had already once defied the whole world by marrying Raymond of Poitiers, who was considerably younger than her and had been brought to Antioch secretly as a simple knight. Now, widowed, she was again at the center of political intrigues. Her cousin, King Baldwin III of Jerusalem, and the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos, who considered Antioch his vassal territory, vied with each other in proposing candidates for her husband. They wanted their own man on the throne of Antioch, obedient and manageable. But Constance rejected one suitor after another. She had no desire to be a pawn in someone else's game. She was looking for a husband who would be not a master, but a partner, capable of protecting her principality and at the same time submitting to her will. And here Raynald of Châtillon enters the stage. By 1153 he was no longer an anonymous mercenary. He had fought in the north within the borders of Antioch, and his valor had been noticed. How exactly he met Princess Constance, history does not say. Perhaps he distinguished himself in the defense of some fortress. Perhaps he was presented at court, but the fact remains that this rough, uncultured, yet charismatic and full of life Burgundian knight managed to conquer the heart of the most powerful woman in Outremer. For everyone it was a shock. The Latin Patriarch of Antioch, Aimery of Limoges, who himself had designs on the regency, was furious. The nobility of the principality grumbled, considering a marriage to a rootless adventurer humiliating. King Baldwin and Emperor Manuel were offended, but Constance showed unbending will. She chose Reynald. Why? Probably she saw in him what was lacking in other, nobler candidates. She saw in him unbridled energy, iron determination, and a complete lack of reverence for authority. He was a man of action, not of court intrigues. He was the sword that she could direct against Antioch's enemies. She thought she could control him. This was her fatal mistake. In 1153, a secret wedding took place. Raynald of Châtillon, yesterday's landless knight, the second son of a minor Burgundian lord, overnight became Prince of Antioch, one of the 4 rulers of the Crusader states. His ascent was like a lightning strike, swift, dazzling, and unpredictable. He had achieved what he could not even have dreamed of when leaving his native castle. He had gained power, a title, and wealth. But with them, he also gained deadly enemies. Nur ad-Din in the east, the Byzantine Emperor in the west, and the envious nobility in his own principality. The world held its breath, waiting to see what this upstart, this wolf in the sheepfold, would do. And Reynald did not keep them waiting long. He would very soon show the whole world that his methods of rule would be as audacious and cruel as his rise to power. The era of relative calm in the north of Outremer had come to an end. The reign of Prince Reynald was beginning. For Raynald of Châtillon, power was not an end in itself, a means to achieve peace or prosperity. It was an instrument for waging war and for personal enrichment. As soon as he was established on the throne of Antioch, he began to act, and his actions shocked both friends and foes. He was a man of simple and direct solutions, who despised diplomatic subtleties. His main argument was the sword, and his main goal was plunder. He viewed his new principality not as a sacred heritage to be cherished, but as a base for conducting raids. The first victim of his unbridled energy was the one who had dared to oppose his marriage, the Latin Patriarch of Antioch, Aimery of Limoges. Reynald did not forgive him his past humiliation. He accused the rich and influential clergyman of colluding with Byzantium, threw him into a dungeon, and subjected him to sophisticated torture. A chronicler of the time, William of Tyre, who clearly disliked Reynald, has left us a gruesome description of this reprisal. Reynald ordered the Patriarch to be stripped naked, his wounds to be smeared with honey, and to be tied to the top of the citadel under the scorching summer sun, leaving him to be devoured by swarms of insects. This barbaric act, committed against one of the highest spiritual dignitaries of Outremer, caused a wave of indignation. Only the intervention of King Baldwin III forced Reynald to release the half-dead Patriarch, who immediately fled to Jerusalem, cursing his tormentor. This episode vividly characterizes the new prince. He was vengeful, cruel, and recognized no authorities, not even ecclesiastical ones. He was demonstrating to everyone that in Antioch there was now only one master. But personal revenge could not satisfy his ambitions and, more importantly, fill his empty treasury. War required money, and Reynald always wanted to wage war. His gaze turned south towards the domains of his powerful neighbor, the Byzantine Empire, specifically to the island of Cyprus. Cyprus in the 12th century was a prosperous province of the Byzantine Empire. Its cities were rich, its fields fertile, and its monasteries held immense treasures accumulated over centuries. At the same time, the island was virtually defenseless. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel I, a brilliant and ambitious ruler, was occupied with wars in the Balkans and Italy. He considered Antioch his vassal principality, and had even promised Reynald a financial subsidy for a war against the Armenians of Cilicia, allies of Nur ad-Din. However, the money from Constantinople never arrived. Manuel probably did not trust the new prince and decided to delay payment. For Reynald, this became a sufficient pretext for declaring war. If the emperor did not want to pay, he would take what was his by force. In 1156, Raynald of Châtillon committed an act that would forever inscribe his name in the annals of the most brutal robber raids of the era. Assembling a fleet and an army, he suddenly landed on defenseless Cyprus. This was not war in the classic sense. It was a pirate action of terrifying scale. For several weeks, Frankish knights and soldiers plundered, burned, and killed. They spared no one, not men, not women, not children. They desecrated churches, broke open altars in search of gold, and destroyed monasteries. Chroniclers describe scenes of violence with horror. Priests had their noses cut off, merchants were tortured to reveal where their wealth was hidden, and peasants were killed or taken into slavery. The entire island was subjected to total plunder. Having loaded his ships with immense booty and captives, Reynald returned to Antioch a triumphator, leaving behind smoking ruins and rivers of blood. This act of vandalism had catastrophic consequences. Firstly, it definitively destroyed any remaining trust between the Crusaders and Byzantium. Cyprus was a Christian island, and its inhabitants were Orthodox brothers in faith. An attack on them was not just robbery, but a sacrilege in the eyes of all of Eastern Christendom. This act demonstrated that for the Prince of Antioch, there were no moral or religious constraints when it came to profit. Secondly, and this was far more dangerous, it awakened the wrath of the Basileus. Emperor Manuel Comnenos was not a man who forgave such insults. The sack of Cyprus was not just the loss of a province, it was a blow to his honor, to the prestige of the entire Byzantine Empire. He vowed revenge, and his revenge was terrible. In 1158, at the head of a huge, perfectly equipped army, Manuel Comnenos marched east. His target was not just a war with the Armenians or Seljuks. His main target was Antioch and the humiliation of the audacious upstart prince. News of the imperial army's approach threw Outremer into a panic. Reynald's forces were negligible compared to the Byzantine might. Resistance was futile. King Baldwin III, understanding that Reynald's madness had endangered all the Crusader states, begged him to repent and ask for forgiveness. And Reynald, realizing the hopelessness of his situation, surrendered, but the scene of his penance became as unforgettable a spectacle as his crimes. When Emperor Manuel set up his camp outside the walls of Antioch, Reynald appeared in it to beg for mercy. He came barefoot in simple clothes of rough sackcloth with a rope around his neck. He prostrated himself before the emperor's throne and lay in the dust while the entire Byzantine nobility looked on with contempt at the humiliation of the Prince of Antioch. He publicly confessed his guilt and swore to become a faithful vassal of the empire. He agreed to all of Manuel's conditions, to return all the plunder, to recognize the supremacy of the Byzantine Emperor, and even to allow a Greek Patriarch and a Byzantine garrison into the citadel of Antioch. Manuel was satisfied. He did not depose Reynald, as he understood that complete chaos in Antioch was not in his interest either. He needed to demonstrate his power, and he did. Manuel's triumphal entry into Antioch was the apotheosis of his triumph. The emperor rode on a magnificent horse, while Prince Reynald and King Baldwin of Jerusalem walked on foot beside his stirrup, like common squires. For the proud and ambitious Reynald, this humiliation was worse than death. He had kept his title and his life, but his pride was crushed. He harbored a grudge. He learned that brute force does not always win, and that there are players in the world far more powerful than he. He would remember this lesson for a long time. But his indomitable nature was not broken. He was only waiting for a new chance to challenge fate again. And that chance soon presented itself, but it led him to an even more terrible fall. The humiliation endured at the hands of Emperor Manuel burned in Reynald's soul. He was forced to submit, but his nature demanded action, revenge, new plunder. As soon as the Byzantine army left the borders of Antioch, he began again to seek an outlet for his restless energy. His gaze turned east towards the lands of his main enemy, Nur ad-Din, the Atabeg of Aleppo and Damascus. Unlike the raid on defenseless Cyprus, this was playing with fire, mortally dangerous but promising rich booty. In 1160 or 1161, the exact dates in the sources vary, Reynald, at the head of a detachment of knights, set out on another plundering raid into the Euphrates River Valley, into territory controlled by the Muslims. His target was the rich pastures and villages of Syrian and Armenian peasants who paid tribute to the Emir of Aleppo. At first, the raid was successful. The Crusaders captured many cattle, prisoners, and other booty, but on the way back, burdened with plunder, they lost their vigilance. Nur ad-Din, who had long been monitoring the actions of his restless neighbor, had set an ambush. Suddenly, from behind the hills, an avalanche of Muslim cavalry descended on Reynald's detachment. The battle was short and brutal. The few and surprised Franks were surrounded and completely routed. Most of the knights fell in battle, and Prince Raynald of Châtillon himself, fighting to the last, was taken prisoner. It was a catastrophe. The ruler of one of the key Crusader states was in the hands of his bitterest enemy. For Nur ad-Din, this was a great stroke of luck. He did not kill his noble captive. A living prince of Antioch was a far more valuable asset than a dead one. He could be used as a bargaining chip in the political game, and most importantly, a colossal ransom could be demanded for him. Reynald was taken to Nur ad-Din's capital, the city of Aleppo, and thrown into the dungeon of its famous citadel. And here, for Raynald of Châtillon, began the longest and darkest chapter of his life. He entered prison a man in his prime, in the flower of his strength. At about 35 or 37 years of age, he would emerge from it only 16 years later, a deep old man by the standards of that era. 16 years, an eternity in the 12th century. In that time, a whole generation would pass. Children would turn into adult warriors, powerful rulers would go to their graves, and the political map of the world would change beyond recognition. We know little about the details of his confinement. The chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, are almost silent about him during this long period. He disappears from the pages of history, becoming a ghost locked in a Syrian dungeon. But we can try to reconstruct what these years were like for him. It was not a dark, damp pit, as one might imagine. High-ranking prisoners in that era were kept in relatively tolerable conditions. He probably had a separate cell, normal food, and the opportunity to communicate with other noble Frankish prisoners, of whom there were many in Aleppo. But the main punishment was not physical suffering, but the complete lack of freedom, humiliation, and uncertainty. Year after year, he waited for a ransom to be paid for him. But the ransom was set at an astronomical amount, unaffordable for Antioch's treasury. His wife, Princess Constance, tried to negotiate, but her power in the principality weakened after her husband's capture. The Antiochian barons, many of whom hated Reynald, were in no hurry to raise funds for his release. Moreover, his stepson, the future Bohemond III, came of age and himself laid claim to the throne. Constance was removed from power and soon died. It seemed everyone had forgotten about Reynald. He was needed by no one. His wife was dead, the principality in the hands of a stepson who despised him. No one was interested in his return. What went on in this man's soul during all those long 16 years? One can assume that his character underwent serious changes. The years of humiliating inaction, of observing his enemies, must have only strengthened his hatred. He saw the strength and organization of the Islamic world from within. He may have learned Arabic, communicating with guards and other prisoners. He listened to their conversations, studied their customs, their faith. But this knowledge did not lead him to understanding or tolerance. On the contrary, it most likely turned his hatred from instinctive and predatory into a conscious, ideological, and even deeper one. He saw the power of Nur ad-Din grow and strengthen, and then, after his death in 1174, he witnessed the dizzying rise of his successor, a young Kurdish emir named Saladin, who united Egypt and Syria under his rule, surrounding the Crusader states with an iron ring. All these years, Reynald sat in his cell and waited. He saw the world change. He saw his contemporaries pass away. King Baldwin III, Emperor Manuel, Nur ad-Din, and he still sat. This long pause, this immersion in darkness must have turned his adventurism into a cold, calculated cruelty. He had lost everything: power, family, freedom, the best years of his life. And he undoubtedly vowed that if fate gave him another chance, he would take revenge. Revenge on everyone, on the Muslims who held him captive, on the Byzantines who had humiliated him, and even on his former Frankish comrades who had betrayed and forgotten him. And in 1176, fate unexpectedly smiled upon him. Something that no one expected any longer happened. After Nur ad-Din's death, a power struggle began in Syria. The new ruler of Aleppo, in search of allies against the rising Saladin, decided to make a gesture of goodwill towards the Franks. A truce was concluded, and as part of a prisoner exchange, Raynald of Châtillon was also released. A huge ransom of 120,000 gold dinars was paid for him, ironically, with the participation of the Byzantine Emperor. A gray-haired, middle-aged man over 50 emerged into freedom. A man whom the world had written off. He returned to Antioch, but there was no place for him there anymore. Bohemond III held the throne firmly. Reynald was a stranger in his former principality. It seemed his story was over. He was a relic of the past, a ghost from another era. But everyone was mistaken. The most important, most bloody, and most fateful part of his life was still ahead. Hardened by 16 years of captivity, filled with fierce hatred, Raynald of Châtillon went south to the kingdom of Jerusalem in search of a new place in the sun, and he would find it. The kingdom of Jerusalem, where the freed Raynald of Châtillon arrived in 1176, was experiencing a troubled and fragile time. On the throne sat the young king Baldwin IV, who went down in history as the Leper King. He was one of the most tragic and at the same time heroic figures of the Crusader era. Stricken from childhood with a terrible disease that slowly consumed his body, he possessed an indomitable will and a clear mind. Despite his progressing ailment, he was an active and wise, personally leading troops into battle. But everyone understood that his reign would not be long, and behind his back, a struggle of court factions for the future succession was already raging. One faction, conventionally called the Peace Party or the Party of Local Barons, was led by Count Raymond III of Tripoli. Representatives of this nobility were born in Outremer. They understood the local specifics better and believed it was necessary to negotiate with the powerful Saladin, to conclude truces and to maintain a fragile balance of power, as a full-scale war would be disastrous for the kingdom. The other faction, the War Party or the Party of Newcomers, consisted of recently arrived knights from Europe, as well as the powerful military religious orders, the Templars and Hospitallers. They held an uncompromising position, considering any truce with the infidels a betrayal and calling for constant offensive warfare. Raynald of Châtillon, with his reputation, experience, and fierce hatred of Muslims, was tailor-made to become the leader and banner of the war party. He immediately joined the court intrigues, and his appearance stirred up the Jerusalem court. He was seen as a man of action, a hero who had suffered for the faith, a warrior who knew no fear or compromise. And soon he received an opportunity to regain power, a power such as he had not had even in Antioch. Fate once again brought him together with a powerful woman. She was Stephanie of Milly, one of the richest and most influential heiresses in the kingdom. She was the widow of 2 noble barons and the ruler of the vast and strategically important lordship of Oultrejordain. This was the land beyond the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, a wild and rugged region that served as the eastern shield of the kingdom of Jerusalem. In 1177, Raynald of Châtillon married Stephanie of Milly. This marriage instantly returned him to the highest echelons of power. He became not just a courtier, he became the ruler of Oultrejordain, lord of the mighty castles of Kerak and Montreal. These were not elegant European chateaux, they were grim, monstrous expressions of military power. Perched like birds of prey on inaccessible cliffs, Kerak, in particular, was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, its walls seemingly growing organically from the cliff itself. From its crenellated walls, Raynald's men could see for many miles around. They could spot the dusty trails of caravans long before the merchants themselves became visible. This was not just a border post, it was a strangling grip, a robber's lair, located with strategic genius right at the throat of Saladin's empire. Any merchant, any pilgrim, any messenger traveling from Cairo to Damascus or back had to pass literally in the shadow of Raynald's castle walls. This gave him incredible power. He was the guardian of the desert, holding his hand on the economic artery that fed his enemy. Reynald immediately began to fortify his new domains. He completed and modernized the castles, turning them into impregnable bastions. He assembled a garrison of loyal knights and mercenaries. Oultrejordain became his personal kingdom, his base from which he could threaten the very heart of Saladin's domains, and he did not delay. For Reynald, any truces that the king of Jerusalem made with Saladin were empty words. His land directly bordered the enemy, and he considered himself entitled to wage his own war. In 1181, in violation of another truce, Reynald carried out a daring raid on a rich caravan coming from Damascus. The booty was enormous. Saladin was furious. He immediately sent envoys to King Baldwin IV, demanding the return of the plunder and the punishment of the oath-breaker. Baldwin, who valued peace, ordered Reynald to return the booty. Reynald's response was defiant and contemptuous. He declared that he was lord in his own land, just as the king was lord in his, and that he had no truces with the Saracens. This response was a slap in the face not only to Saladin, but also to his own king. It demonstrated that Reynald obeyed no one. He was an uncontrollable force, a torpedo launched into the fragile structure of diplomatic relations. Each of his raids provoked Saladin into retaliatory actions, into punitive raids that ravaged the kingdom's lands. The peace party, led by Raymond of Tripoli, saw Reynald as a madman dragging everyone into a disastrous war. The war party, however, saw him as a hero, the only one who dared to inflict real damage on the enemy. Saladin himself began to feel a personal, burning hatred for Reynald. He saw in him not just an enemy baron, but the embodiment of all the worst in the Franks. Their perfidy, greed, and cruelty. Reynald became for him a personal enemy, a man whom he vowed to destroy, but his most audacious, most insane, and most provocative plan Reynald was yet to conceive. Raids on caravans were just a warm-up for him. He was planning something unheard of, an act that was supposed to shake the entire Islamic world to its foundations and immortalize his name forever. He decided to strike at the very heart of Islam. The plan that formed in Raynald of Châtillon's mind in the winter of 1182 to 1183 was staggering in its audacity, bordering on madness. It was a plan that had never occurred to anyone before. He decided to take the war from land to sea, but not the Mediterranean, but the Red Sea, the inland sea of the Islamic world, the sacred waters that lapped the shores of Arabia. His ultimate goal was not just piracy. His goal was the holy cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina. He wanted to plunder and burn Medina, where the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad was located, and then move on to Mecca to desecrate the Kaaba, the main sanctuary of all Muslims. This was more than a military operation. It was an act of total, absolute sacrilege, an ideological blow of monstrous force. The success of such an operation could not only enrich him, but could also undermine the morale of the entire Islamic world and possibly even destroy Saladin's authority as the defender of the faith. It was a risk, but the reward in case of success was unimaginable. The logistics of this enterprise were nightmarish. The Crusaders had no port on the Red Sea. The closest point was the Gulf of Aqaba, which was hundreds of kilometers across a waterless desert from Reynald's castle at Kerak. But this did not stop Reynald. He ordered 5 galleys to be built in his Mediterranean port of Ascalon. Then, in the strictest secrecy, the ships were dismantled. Every plank, every rope, every sail was loaded onto camels, and this incredible caravan, ships in the desert, moved across the Sinai Peninsula to the Gulf of Aqaba. There on the shore of the Red Sea, the ships were reassembled. Reynald placed loyal men in command of the flotilla. He himself led the land forces that captured the small port town of Ayla, modern Aqaba, securing a base for the fleet. And so, a squadron of 5 Frankish galleys set out into the Red Sea. The initial effect was stunning. The Muslims were completely unprepared. There had never been a war on the Red Sea. There were no naval fleets there, only peaceful merchant and pilgrim ships. The appearance of Frankish pirates caused panic and terror. Reynald's flotilla split. 2 galleys blockaded Ayla from the sea, while the other 3 moved south along the coast of Arabia, sowing death and destruction. They plundered merchant ships and attacked coastal ports. But their main target was ships with pilgrims heading to Mecca. In one raid, they captured and sank a vessel carrying Muslim Hajis. News of this spread throughout the Islamic world, causing a wave of anger and fury. Frankish pirates in sacred waters killing defenseless pilgrims. It was unthinkable. Saladin, who was in Syria at the time, was shocked and enraged. He understood the monstrous nature of the threat. He immediately ordered his brother and governor in Egypt, Al-Adil, to do everything possible to stop the sacrilegious pirates. A fleet was hastily built in Cairo. Admiral Hussam ad-Din Lulu was appointed to command it. The Egyptian fleet set out from Suez in pursuit. Meanwhile, Reynald's pirates continued their bloody raid. They reached the coast of the Hejaz, coming dangerously close to Medina. They burned several small ports and were preparing to land troops for a march on the holy city. But time had run out. Admiral Lulu's fleet caught up with them. The naval battle was short. Weary from the long raid and outnumbered, the Franks were defeated. Some were killed in battle, others were captured. A small detachment managed to land on the shore and tried to escape into the desert, but was caught and destroyed by Bedouins. The execution of the prisoners was demonstrative and cruel. Saladin wanted not just to punish them, he wanted to send a clear signal to the whole world. The prisoners were brought to Cairo, where they were paraded through the streets and beheaded in front of a cheering crowd. A few of the most noble prisoners were to be executed in a particularly agonizing way. They were taken to the valley of Mina, near Mecca, where they were sacrificed like camels during the main Muslim festival of Eid al-Adha. It was a revenge equal in its symbolic cruelty to the crime itself. Raynald of Châtillon himself did not participate in the naval campaign. He remained in his castle at Kerak, but for the entire Islamic world it was he who was the organizer and instigator of this monstrous sacrilege. From this moment on, he was no longer just an enemy. He became the personal enemy of Saladin and of all Islam. Saladin swore twice that if Reynald ever fell into his hands, he would kill him with his own hand. The raid on the Red Sea had failed. It had not achieved its main objectives, but its consequences were enormous. It had definitively destroyed any possibility of peaceful coexistence. It had turned the war from a political one into a deeply personal and religious one. Raynald of Châtillon had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had challenged the Prophet himself. And the response to this challenge was only a matter of time. The fuse of a great war had been lit, and it was burning inexorably, approaching the powder keg that was the kingdom of Jerusalem. While Raynald of Châtillon was ruling Oultrejordain, turning it into a robber's den and provoking Saladin to ever more decisive actions, a tragedy of a different kind was unfolding in the kingdom's capital, Jerusalem. The political scene increasingly resembled a nest of vipers, where everyone was ready to strike everyone else for power, sensing the imminent end of an era. At the center of this web of intrigue was the young king Baldwin IV. His disease, leprosy, was progressing inexorably. By the early 1180s, he was virtually blind. His hands and feet were disfigured by sores, and he could barely move. But his mind remained sharp, and his will, iron. Wrapped in bandages, hiding his disfigured face under a mask, this boy king tried to the last to hold his kingdom together. He personally, on a litter, appeared on the battlefields, and the mere sight of him inspired the soldiers. Baldwin was a supporter of a moderate policy. He understood that the kingdom's forces were limited and that an open war with the combined might of Saladin would be suicide. He sought to maintain truces, maneuvering between court factions, but his physical condition made him a hostage to his entourage. The war party, of which Reynald was the informal leader, was becoming increasingly influential at court. The influence of this faction was built on a cocktail of religious fanaticism, personal ambitions, and deep-seated grievances. The Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard of Ridefort, was a key figure, driven by a burning personal hatred for Raymond of Tripoli, who had once prevented him from marrying a wealthy heiress. For Gerard, undermining Raymond's authority was as important as fighting Saladin. He found his perfect instrument in Guy of Lusignan. Contemporaries described Guy as a man more handsome than wise, whose main talents lay in courtly manners rather than the art of governance or war. He was easily influenced, craved approval, and was completely under the influence of his ambitious wife Sibylla and such decisive advisors as Gerard and Reynald. This triumvirate of ambition, fanaticism, and reckless pragmatism formed a perfect storm around the weak and wavering king. In 1183, Baldwin IV's condition worsened so much that he was forced to appoint Guy of Lusignan as regent of the kingdom. This was a catastrophic decision. Guy possessed neither the authority nor the military talents, nor the political wisdom. In the same year, Saladin, provoked by another of Reynald's raids, invaded Galilee with a huge army. The entire Crusader army was assembled to repel him. But Guy of Lusignan, appointed commander-in-chief, showed complete indecision. He did not dare to engage in battle, and after several days of pointless standoff, both armies withdrew. The Frankish barons were furious with his passivity and cowardice. Even the dying Baldwin IV realized his mistake. Gathering his last strength, he did the incredible. He removed Guy of Lusignan from the regency, stripped him of all rights, and declared his heir to be the young son of Sibylla from her first marriage, his nephew Baldwin IV. The regent for the child king was appointed the most ardent opponent of the war party, Raymond III of Tripoli. It seemed that the moderate party had prevailed. In 1185, Baldwin IV, the martyr king, died. He was only 24. His short life had been a feat, but his death opened Pandora's box. A year later, in 1186, the little King Baldwin V also died suddenly. The kingdom was left without a ruler, and then the war party staged a coup d'état. Sibylla and her supporters, including Reynald and Gerard of Ridefort, locked themselves in Jerusalem and, against the will of most barons and the late king's testament, crowned Guy of Lusignan and Sibylla herself. Raymond of Tripoli and his supporters refused to recognize the usurper and retired to their own domains. The kingdom was on the brink of civil war. Saladin closely watched this self-destruction in the enemy camp. He saw that the most reckless and aggressive forces had come to power. He concluded a new truce with Raymond of Tripoli, effectively isolating Jerusalem. But he was waiting for a pretext to start a great decisive war. And that pretext was provided to him, as always, by Raynald of Châtillon. In late 1186 or early 1187, despite an existing general truce between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Raynald carried out his last and most fateful raid. This was not a simple border violation. It was a calculated act of defiance against his own king and the entire policy of coexistence. A solemn truce sealed by the oath of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was in effect. But for Reynald, a truce with infidels was merely a suggestion, not a command. He saw a caravan laden with the riches of Egypt as too tempting a prize to pass up, and perhaps in his strategic calculation as a way to provoke a final decisive battle before Saladin grew even stronger. He might have believed he was acting in the kingdom's interest, pushing the weak king to action, but the result was catastrophic. The booty was unimaginable, but it was not just about gold and goods. According to some, though disputed Muslim sources, Saladin's own sister was in this caravan. Whether this was true or not no longer mattered. The fact of attacking a huge caravan during an official peace was a flagrant violation of all oaths and treaties. Saladin again sent envoys, this time to the new king, Guy of Lusignan, demanding the return of the captives and treasures. This was his final ultimatum. Guy, who had become king thanks to Reynald's support, found himself in a trap. He ordered Reynald to return everything, but Reynald, as before, just laughed in his face. He declared that in his own lands he was his own king, and this was the last straw. Saladin no longer had any reason to wait. The perfidy of the Franks had reached its limit. He declared a holy war, a jihad. From all corners of his empire, from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, troops began to flock to him. He assembled the greatest army the Islamic world had ever seen. His goal was not just to punish Raynald of Châtillon. His goal was the complete and final destruction of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Reynald, with his greed and oath-breaking, had given Saladin the perfect pretext, which united the entire Muslim world. King Guy, weak and indecisive under pressure from hawks like Gerard of Redefort, adopted the most disastrous of all possible plans. He ordered all garrisons from all castles and cities to be assembled, leaving the rear exposed, and to march the entire army of the kingdom to meet Saladin. Even Raymond of Tripoli, understanding that it was a matter of survival, was forced to join the royal army. Two huge forces were marching towards each other. The place of their meeting would be the hills near the Sea of Galilee. The place of their meeting would be Hattin. The apocalypse was inevitable, and its chief architect was the Lord of Oultrejordain, Raynald of Châtillon. The summer of 1187 was unbearably hot. The stones melted under the sun, and the air was still and scorching as in a forge. It was into this inferno that King Guy of Lusignan led his army. It was the largest force the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever fielded, about 20,000 warriors, including over 1,200 heavy-armed knights, the flower of Frankish soldiery, and a large detachment of light cavalry, the Turcopoles, as well as thousands of infantrymen. With them they carried the greatest relic of the Christian world, a fragment of the true cross on which they believed Jesus Christ had been crucified. Its presence was meant to inspire the warriors to victory. Saladin's army outnumbered them, but that was not his main advantage. Saladin was a brilliant strategist. He knew this terrain perfectly and understood that in such heat, the main enemy of the knights in their heavy armor would be not the Saracen blade, but thirst. He began with a provocation. His detachments besieged the town of Tiberias on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, where the wife of Raymond of Tripoli was. The royal council assembled at Sepphoris, where the Crusaders had a camp with water sources. Raymond of Tripoli, whose wife was under siege, wanted more than anyone to save the city. But he was an experienced warrior and understood the trap. He made a passionate speech imploring King Guy not to move. He said that he would rather lose Tiberias and his wife than they all lose the kingdom. He proposed to stay by the water, arguing that Saladin could not hold an army in this desert for long, would leave, and they would win without a fight. But if they marched to Tiberias, they would all die of thirst. Most of the barons agreed with him. The plan was reasonable. But that night, the master of the Templars, Gerard of Redefort, Raymond's personal enemy, entered the king's tent. He began to whisper in the king's ear, accusing Raymond of cowardice and even treason. He persuaded Guy that refusing to go to the aid of a besieged city would be a disgrace, and the weak, indecisive king gave in. At dawn on July 3rd, he gave the order that became the death sentence for his army to march on Tiberias. It was a death march, 25 kilometers through a waterless, sun-scorched landscape. From the very beginning, they were harassed by flying detachments of Saracen cavalry. They showered the Crusaders with clouds of arrows, attacked the rear guard, giving them no rest. But the main enemy was thirst. The water in the waterskins quickly ran out. The throats of knights and infantrymen went dry, their tongues swelled. The heavy armor turned into scorching ovens. The army moved slower and slower. Its formation began to break down. Saladin allowed them to cover most of the way. He was waiting. In the evening, the exhausted Crusader army reached a height with two hills known as the Horns of Hattin. The Sea of Galilee, blue and tempting, was visible in the distance, but the path to it was blocked by Saladin's entire army. The Franks were trapped. They stopped for the night on this waterless height, surrounded on all sides. During the night, the Saracens set fire to the dry scrub around the Crusader camp. The acrid smoke mixed with dust and heat, making the unbearable night even more agonizing. The cries of men dying of thirst and the neighing of crazed horses echoed in the darkness. On the morning of July 4th, hell began. The infantrymen, mad with thirst, broke ranks and tried to break through to the lake, but they were immediately slaughtered or scattered. The knights who remained on the hill understood that this was the end, but they decided to die with honor. Several times they gathered their last strength and launched desperate charges on the center of Saladin's army, where the Sultan himself was. They tried to break through to him, knowing that his death could turn the tide of the battle. Among those who led these charges was Raynald of Châtillon. He fought with the fury of a doomed miss, his sword striking left and right. But the forces were unequal. By the end of the day, it was all over. The Crusader army was destroyed. Thousands were killed, even more were taken prisoner. The True Cross was captured, which became a terrible moral blow to the entire Christian world. All the noblest barons of the kingdom fell into Saladin's hands. King Guy of Lusignan, the master of the Templars Gerard of Ridefort, and, of course, Raynald of Châtillon. The prisoners were brought to the Sultan's tent, and here unfolded the scene with which we began our story. The scene with the cup of water, which became the final act in Raynald's life. After Saladin had spoken his fateful words, he turned directly to Reynald. He reminded him of all his crimes, the broken oaths, the plundered caravans, the raid on the holy cities. He offered him to convert to Islam to save his life. Raynald of Châtillon, facing certain death, did not flinch. He contemptuously rejected Saladin's offer. He looked his enemy straight in the eye and, according to the Arab chronicler Imad ad-Din, laughed. Then Saladin stood up, took his sword and struck Raynald on the neck. The guards immediately finished the job and cut off his head. Saladin's oath was fulfilled. His personal enemy was dead. King Guy, trembling with terror at the sight of this scene, was reassured by Saladin, who said that kings do not kill kings, but this man had crossed all boundaries. Raynald of Châtillon's death was like his life, audacious, bloody, and uncompromising. He died as he had lived, not asking for mercy and recognizing no authority over him, but his own will. But his death was merely a prelude to the fall of everything he had defended with his barbaric methods. With the destruction of the army at Hattin, the kingdom of Jerusalem was left defenseless. The way to Jerusalem was open. The death of Raynald of Châtillon in Saladin's tent was not just the execution of a baron. It became the symbolic finale of an entire era. The head that rolled from the shoulders of the Prince of Oultrejordain was a harbinger of the fall of the crown of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. After the catastrophe at Hattin, Saladin, in a matter of months, with virtually no resistance, captured almost all the cities and castles of the Crusaders. And on October 2nd, 1187, after a short siege, the holy city of Jerusalem itself fell into his hands. The Christian rule over the city, which had lasted for 88 years, had ended. What then was Raynald of Châtillon's role in this great drama? To assess his legacy is no easy task, for his figure divides the opinions of historians just as his actions divided the world in which he lived. For the Muslim chroniclers of his time and for the subsequent Islamic tradition, He is absolute evil. Ruyan, the Oathbreaker, a cruel and treacherous tyrant whose sacrilegious deeds knew no bounds. He is the perfect villain, whose destruction at the hands of the noble Saladin appears as an act of supreme justice, a deserved punishment for all his sins. It was his reckless provocations, in their view, that made the Great War inevitable and gave Saladin the moral right to deliver a crushing blow. For many of his Christian contemporaries, especially from the peace party, such as the chronicler William of Tyre, Raynald was an adventurer and a madman, whose unbridled greed and political short-sightedness doomed the kingdom. They saw his actions as the main cause of the catastrophe. He violated vital truces, provoked a powerful enemy, undermined the authority of the royal power, and ultimately led the flower of knighthood to the fields of Hattin, where it was destroyed. From this perspective, Reynald is a tragic example of how the personal ambitions of one man can lead to the downfall of an entire state. However, there is another view. Some modern historians urge us not to judge Reynald by today's moral standards, but to try to understand his logic in the context of the brutal reality of 12th century Outremer. From this perspective, Reynald was not a madman. He was a pragmatist driven to extremes. He perhaps understood better than others that long-term coexistence with Saladin's empire was impossible. Saladin did not hide his ultimate goal, the complete expulsion of the Franks from the Holy Land. Any truce for him was merely a tactical respite to gather strength. Reynald, on the other hand, acted preemptively. His raids on caravans were not just robbery but a form of economic warfare, an attempt to cut the financial arteries that fed Saladin's war machine. His raid on the Red Sea, for all its sacrilegious audacity, was a strategic blow aimed at undermining Saladin's prestige as the defender of Islam. Perhaps Reynald believed that the kingdom's only chance of survival was not passive defense and humiliating treaties, but constant, aggressive warfare of attrition that would give the enemy no rest. He was a proponent of a preemptive strike, and in this sense, he was not so much the cause of the war as its catalyst, accelerating an inevitable conflict. He did not create the threat. The threat, in the person of Saladin, already existed. He merely chose the riskiest and most direct way to combat it. So who was he, Raynald of Châtillon? A hero or a villain, a defender of the faith or a greedy pirate? A strategist or an adventurer? The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the middle, in the gray area between black and white. He was a product of his era, an era of ruthless second sons seeking glory and fortune with a sword in hand. His character was forged in the crucible of captivity and tempered in the fire of desert raids. He was a man of extremes, incredibly brave and unimaginably cruel, a charismatic leader and a perfidious oathbreaker. His life is an epic saga of a dizzying rise and a crushing fall. It is a story of how the will, ambition, and character of one man can become the stone that starts an avalanche, changing the course of history. The fall of Jerusalem caused a shock in Europe and led to the Third Crusade, which brought to the Holy Land the greatest monarchs of the time, including Richard the Lionheart. And at the origin of all these grandiose events stood the shadow of one man, a red-haired baron from Burgundy who had once gone to the east in search of his destiny and found it in the Sultan's tent, meeting death with a sneer on his lips. His name is forever imprinted on the pages of history as an eternal reminder of how thin the line can be between courage and recklessness, and how high the price can be for the right to write the laws of one's own life. You have listened to the story of Raynald of Châtillon, a story that proves that the past is never simple. Thank you for your time and attention. If you wish to continue delving into the most dramatic and ambiguous pages of world history, please subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, and share this account with those who might be interested. Many more journeys through time await us.